Why would a cowboy risk his name for a woman the whole town refused to stand beside? Rainwater dripped from the edge of the church roof as Rosie Whittaker hit the frozen wooden steps hard enough to crack the basket handle in her hand. Bread rolled through the mud. Nobody moved. A horse snorted nearby. Boots scraped against wet boards. And then one cowboy stepped out of the crowd and bent down beside her, while the entire town watched in silence. Comment below where you're watching from before this story begins. The church bell in Dry Creek rang slow that Sunday morning, its heavy sound rolling across frozen wagon tracks and snow-packed rooftops. Wind swept down from the northern hills, hard enough to rattle the loose boards on the livery stable. Folks kept their collars high and their heads down as they stepped out of St. Matthew's Church into the pale gray light. Winter had not fully loosened its grip on Wyoming territory yet. Men gathered beside hitching posts, talking cattle prices and late snow. Women stood near the church steps, trading recipes, gossip and quiet judgments wrapped inside smiles. Rosie Whittaker came through the side gate, carrying a covered basket against her chest. The cloth over the bread was still warm. She had been awake before sunrise, baking in the tiny iron stove inside her rented room above the tailor's shop. Her right leg dragged slightly with each careful step across the frozen dirt. Not enough to stop her moving, just enough for people to notice. And people always noticed. Rosie kept her eyes lowered as she approached the church steps. Her coat sleeves were too short at the wrists. One glove had been mended twice near the thumb. Still, the bread smelled rich with butter and cornmeal, better than most anything on the donation table. She reached the top step. Then her boot slipped. The wood beneath her had frozen slick overnight. The basket flew from her hands. Rosie hit the steps hard on one knee, her shoulder striking the railing with a sharp crack. The cloth covering came loose. Round loaves rolled down into the muddy slush below. For one long second, nobody moved. A few men glanced over and quickly looked away again. Two women near the door exchanged quiet looks before turning back to their conversation. Rosie tried pushing herself upright, but pain shot through her bad leg, so suddenly her breath caught. One loaf rested upside down in the mud beside a horse trough. "Shame," somebody muttered softly. Then Earl Dunning from the feed store spat tobacco into the snow and said loud enough for half the street to hear, "Girl like that only becomes work for some poor fool dumb enough to marry her." A few nervous chuckles followed. Rosie froze where she was. Not because the words were new, because she was tired of hearing them sound so easy coming from other people's mouths. The cold wind moved through the street again. Somewhere nearby, a loose shutter slammed against wood. Then Boots stepped into the mud beside the scattered bread. A man crouched, without saying a word, tall, broad shoulders, dark coat dusted with melted snow, leather gloves worn pale across the palms, the kind of man people recognized before he even spoke. Wyatt Granger. He had just ridden down from the northern range that morning. Folks said he spent more time alone with cattle and mountains than with people. Some called him difficult. Others called him dangerous after whiskey. Most simply stayed out of his way. Wyatt picked up one loaf carefully, brushing mud from the cloth with slow hands before placing it back into the basket. Then another and another. The whole street had gone quiet. Rosie stared at him, confused more than anything else. "You don't gotta do that," she said quietly. Wyatt finally looked up at her. His eyes were lighter than she expected, cold-looking at first glance, but steady. "Seems like somebody should," he answered. He stood and handed her the basket. Their fingers brushed only a second. Still, Rosie felt it. Behind them, somebody laughed nervously. "Careful, Wyatt. Folks are gonna think you're fixing to marry her." A couple men smirked. Wyatt did not smile back. He rested one hand on the church railing beside Rosie and looked straight toward the crowd gathered outside St. Matthew's. "If she agreed," he said calmly, "I'd consider that an honor. Silence dropped across the street so hard it almost felt physical. Even the horses seemed still. Rosie looked at him like she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. No man had ever spoken about her that way before. Not in public, not where others could hear. Earl Dunning scoffed under his breath, but nobody joined in this time. Wyatt tipped his hat once toward Rosie and stepped back. "That storm's moving fast from the west," he said. "You ought to get inside before dark." Then he walked toward his horse without waiting for another word. The spell broke the moment he rode off. Whispers started immediately. Rosie could feel them following her all the way down the street. By sundown, snow began falling hard over Dry Creek. The wind screamed between buildings, carrying sharp ice through the air. Rosie sat alone beside the small window in her rented room, listening to the storm beat against the glass. Down below, the town lanterns flickered through white curtains of snow. She replayed Wyatt's words over and over despite herself. I'd consider that an honor. It made no sense. Men pitied women like her sometimes, used them, ignored them. But they did not look proud standing beside them. Rosie pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried convincing herself to forget the whole thing. By morning, the storm had softened into drifting snow. A knock came at her door just after sunrise. Rosie frowned and opened it carefully. Wyatt Granger stood outside beside a wagon dusted white with snow. A leather travel bag rested near his boots. Steam rose from the horses in the cold morning air. Rosie blinked in surprise. "Mr. Granger." Wyatt removed his hat slowly. "I need a woman at the ranch," he said. She stared at him, speechless. Not far below, two townsfolk passing the alley had already stopped walking. Wyatt's voice stayed calm. "Not somebody perfect," he said. "Just you." The wind moved softly between them. And for the first time in years, Rosie Whittaker did not know whether to be afraid or hopeful. Snow slid from the roof above her window in slow, heavy sheets. Somewhere down the alley, a mule brayed against the cold morning air. Rosie tightened her grip on the doorframe. "You barely know me." Wyatt looked past her shoulder into the narrow room behind her. One iron bed, a wash basin with cracked edges, a tiny stove struggling to hold heat. "Maybe," he said, "but I know what kind of town this is." His words settled quietly between them. Rosie glanced toward the street. Two women near the Mercantile were already pretending not to stare at Wyatt's wagon parked outside her building. "You asking me to work for you?" she asked carefully. Wyatt nodded once. "Cook if you want. Keep the place standing. Tell me if the cattle break through fencing." A faint breath left him in the cold. "Or don't talk much at all. That's fine too." That almost made her smile. Almost. 3 days later, Rosie left Dry Creek beside him beneath a pale gray sky. The wagon wheels creaked across frozen roads, leading north toward the Absaroka foothills. Snow still covered patches of open land beneath the pine trees, though streams had begun breaking loose from winter ice. Wyatt spoke little during the ride. Not rude, just quiet in the way mountains were quiet. By late afternoon, Broken Pine Ranch appeared through the trees. The ranch house sat near a long, split-rail fence weathered silver from years of wind. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Beyond the barn stretched dry winter dark hills rolling toward the mountains. Rosie climbed down carefully from the wagon. Her bad leg stiffened from the ride, but before she could steady herself against the wheel, Wyatt had already moved an old wooden crate closer, like he'd noticed without looking. He never mentioned it, not once. Inside, the ranch house smelled faintly of cedar smoke, saddle leather, and coffee left warming too long on a stove. Old Ben Mercer looked up from the kitchen table as they entered. The old ranch hand had a white beard and rough hands thick as tree roots. "So this is the lady," Ben said, rising slowly. Rosie braced herself for questions. Instead, Ben removed his hat politely. "Mom." That was all, and somehow it meant more. The first week passed quietly. Rosie unpacked the few things she owned into a small bedroom near the back of the house. Wyatt spent most daylight hours outside with cattle or repairing fencing, damaged during winter storms. But she noticed things, small things. The loose board outside the porch steps disappeared. One morning, a second railing appeared beside the water pump 2 days later. The tall shelf near the kitchen stove somehow became lower overnight. Wyatt never explained any of it. He simply acted as though the ranch had always been built that way. One icy morning before sunrise, Rosie entered the kitchen and found a sack of fresh flour beside the table. No note, just flour. She turned when Wyatt came inside carrying firewood under one arm. "You bought this?" He set the wood down beside the stove. "June Holloway brought supplies out from town yesterday." Rosie hesitated. "You remembered I bake." Wyatt shrugged out of his coat slowly. Hard not to. That afternoon, warm cornbread cooled beside the kitchen window, while snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof outside. For the first time in years, the ranch house felt lived in. Even Ben noticed. "Place stopped sounding haunted," he muttered over supper one evening. Rosie laughed softly before she could stop herself. Wyatt looked up from his coffee at the sound. It was brief. Barely a moment. Still, Rosie noticed the corner of his mouth move like he almost smiled too. Days turned into weeks. The air softened with the first signs of spring. Some evenings, Wyatt returned long after dark, smelling of horse sweat, cold wind, and pine smoke. Rosie would leave a plate warming near the stove without asking whether he wanted it. Every time he ate it. One night, a hard storm rolled down from the mountains without warning. Rain hammered the roof while wind shook the barn doors violently against their hinges. Rosie carried a lantern across the muddy yard toward the stable after hearing one of the horses kicking wildly inside. Her boot slipped near the entrance. Pain shot through her leg as the ground vanished beneath her. Before she hit the mud completely, strong hands caught her by the waist. The lantern swung wildly between them. Wyatt steadied her against his chest while rain soaked both their coats within seconds. "You all right?" he asked sharply. Rosie nodded too fast. "I'm fine," but her hand still gripped his sleeve. For a second, neither moved. The lantern light flickered across rainwater, running down Wyatt's face. His hand remained at her back longer than necessary, careful and steady. Then the stable doors slammed again behind them, and the moment broke apart. Later that week, Rosie rode into Dry Creek with Ben for supplies. Inside the feed store, she paused, near stacked grain sacks, when voices drifted from the back counter. "She's still up there at Broken Pine?" "Wyatt's got a soft heart for strays, I guess." A low chuckle followed. "Ain't love, just pity." Rosie stood very still. The paper parcel in her hands suddenly felt heavier. Outside, wind rattled the hitching posts along Main Street. She said nothing during the ride back to the ranch. That night, after Wyatt's lamp finally went dark upstairs, Rosie quietly folded her dresses into the old travel case she had brought from Dry Creek. Then she stopped beside the kitchen table. The fresh railing outside the porch cast long shadows through the moonlit window. Rosie touched the handle of her suitcase tightly, and for the first time since arriving at Broken Pine Ranch, she began planning how to leave. The house stayed quiet except for the ticking of the old clock near the stove. Rosie folded her dresses carefully into the worn travel case, resting on the kitchen chair. 2 plain blouses, a winter shawl, her mother's small Bible wrapped in cloth. That was nearly everything she owned. Upstairs, Wyatt's footsteps crossed slowly from one end of the hall to the other. Then silence again. Rosie lowered herself into the chair beside the lantern and stared at the weak yellow light trembling against the table. Outside, spring rain tapped softly against the windows. Snowmelt dripped from the roof in uneven rhythms. She told herself leaving was the right thing. Men like Wyatt Granger deserved easier lives than this. Cleaner lives. Not whispers every time they entered town. Near midnight, Rosie carried the suitcase quietly toward the door. Her bad leg ached from the cold, damp weather, but she forced herself not to stop. She paused once beside the porch railing Wyatt had built for her. Her fingers brushed the smooth wood briefly. Then she stepped out into the rain. The mountain road beyond Broken Pine Ranch had already turned thick with mud. Rain fell steady beneath a sky black as coal smoke. Rosie kept one hand tight around the suitcase while the other held her coat closed against the wind. She walked as far as the old Black Elk crossing before pain finally slowed her. The wooden bridge stretched over a narrow gorge where snow runoff rushed violently through the rocks below. Lantern light from Dry Creek was still miles away. Rosie lowered herself onto a damp crate beside the bridge rail and shut her eyes. Rainwater dripped from her hair onto her sleeves. For the first time since coming to Broken Pine, she let herself cry. Not loudly, just quietly enough that the storm almost swallowed the sound. Back at the ranch, Wyatt noticed the empty bedroom before dawn. The blanket had been folded neatly across the bed. The kitchen lantern had burned itself out, and Rosie's coat hook beside the door stood empty. For one long moment, Wyatt simply stared at it. Then he grabbed his hat and headed for the barn. Ben Mercer caught sight of him, saddling the horse in the rain. "Boy, where you headed at this hour?" Wyatt tightened the cinch hard enough to make the horse shift sideways. She left. Ben's face darkened immediately. Without another word, Wyatt rode out into the storm. Rain lashed across his coat as he followed wagon tracks leading north from the ranch road. Mud splashed beneath the horse's hooves. Twice he nearly lost the trail entirely where runoff crossed the road. But he kept riding. By the time he reached Black Elk Bridge, dawn still hadn't broken. Rosie heard the horse first, then Wyatt's voice through the rain. "Rosie!" She looked up too quickly. Wyatt dismounted hard enough to splash mud across his boots. His face looked sharper than she had ever seen it. Wet hair clung to his forehead beneath his hat brim. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded. Rosie stood slowly, gripping the suitcase tighter. "You shouldn't have come after me." "The hell I shouldn't." The words came faster than usual from him. Wyatt stepped forward and took the suitcase straight from her hand before she could stop him. "You think you can barely walk half these roads alone in this weather?" "I managed before you," Rosie shot back quietly. Something in Wyatt's face shifted then. Not anger exactly, something closer to hurt. Rain hammered the bridge around them. Rosie looked away first. "Folks already talk enough. You don't deserve that because of me." Wyatt stared at her like he could hardly believe what he was hearing. "So that's what this is?" he asked. "You think I brought you there out of pity?" Rosie swallowed hard. "You didn't have to say it," she whispered. "I heard what people say." Wyatt ran one tired hand across his face before looking out toward the dark gorge below. "When I was younger," he said slowly, "there was a woman I planned to marry." Rosie blinked in surprise. Wyatt rarely spoke about himself at all. "She left after I sold half my land, helping my brother settle his debts." His voice stayed calm, but distant somehow. "Said she didn't sign up for a hard life." Rainwater rolled from the brim of his hat. "After that, I stopped expecting much from people." Rosie watched him carefully. Wyatt looked back at her then. "But you," he shook his head faintly. "You walked into a town that spent years trying to make you feel small, and you still kept showing up every Sunday carrying bread for folks who barely looked at you." Rosie's eyes filled again before she could stop it. "No one chooses somebody like me," she said softly. Wyatt stepped closer. "I did." The wind moved sharply through the bridge rails. Wyatt's voice dropped lower. "The moment I saw you stand back up outside that church without a single person helping you." Neither of them moved for several seconds. The rain softened slightly around them. Then suddenly, far across the hills behind the ranch, an orange glow burst against the dark sky. Wyatt turned first. His face changed instantly. Smoke. Heavy smoke. A second later came the faint sound of horses screaming through the storm. Rosie's breath caught. "The barn," Wyatt said, and before the words fully settled between them, He was already throwing himself back onto the saddle and riding hard toward Broken Pine Ranch. Rain slashed sideways across the road as Rosie struggled after him in the wagon trail mud. Her bad leg burned with every uneven step, but fear-piddle pushed her forward faster than pain ever could. By the time she reached the ranch gate, flames were tearing through the upper half of the horse barn. Orange light flashed against the wet pine trees. Horses screamed inside the smoke, while sparks blew across the yard like swarms of fireflies. Ben Mercer and two ranch hands were hauling buckets from the water trough, shouting over the storm. "Get the south gate open. The beam's gonna give." Wyatt didn't wait for anyone. He charged straight into the smoke-filled stable with a wet blanket wrapped around one arm. Rosie's heart nearly stopped. "Wyatt!" she shouted, but he disappeared inside before the sound reached him. The next several minutes blurred together in smoke, rain, and chaos. One frightened mare burst through the side door, nearly knocking Ben into the mud. Another horse kicked against broken stall boards while flames climbed the rafters overhead. Then Wyatt emerged through the smoke, leading two terrified horses by their reins. His coat sleeve had blackened from sparks. Blood ran from a cut near his temple. Still, he turned immediately toward the barn again. Rosie caught his arm before he could go back inside. "The roof's falling," she said breathlessly. For a second, he looked ready to argue. Then the top beam cracked loudly overhead. The roof collapsed inward in a shower of sparks. Heat rolled across the yard, hard enough to force everyone backward. Silence followed. Only rain remained. Hours later, dawn crept gray and exhausted over Broken Pine Ranch. Smoke drifted from the ruins while soaked fence posts steamed quietly in the cold air. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table with his injured shoulder wrapped in clean bandages. Rosie stood beside the stove heating water, while Ben slept upright in a nearby chair, hat pulled low over his face. Nobody spoke much. The loss hung too heavy in the room. Rosie carried a cup of black coffee toward Wyatt carefully. He reached for it with his good hand, wincing slightly as he moved. "You should rest," she said softly. Wyatt looked at the burned barn through the window. "Can't afford much rest right now." Rosie noticed the ledger books spread across the table beside him. Feed costs, repair estimates, debt numbers scratched beside cattle counts. One missing barn could ruin a ranch after winter, especially this far from town. Later that afternoon, Rosie walked through the ruins alone. Rainwater dripped from charred beams. The smell of wet ash clung to everything. Near the back wall, half hidden beneath blackened wood, she noticed something strange. A broken lantern. Its glass had shattered outward. Rosie crouched slowly beside it. The oil reservoir still smelled fresh. Too fresh. Her eyes narrowed. That night, June Holloway arrived from Dry Creek carrying supplies in her wagon. The widow's face tightened the moment she saw the burned stable. "This wasn't accident enough for my liking," June muttered quietly while unpacking canned peaches and medical bandages. Rosie hesitated before showing her the lantern remains wrapped inside cloth. June studied it carefully. Then her expression darkened. "You need to keep your eyes open around Clyde Rawlins." Rosie had heard the name before. Everyone in Wyoming Territory knew Clyde Rawlins, big cattle owner, rich enough to buy judges' favors and sheriff's whiskey. His ranch bordered the creeklands east of Broken Pine. "What does he want with Wyatt?" Rosie asked. June gave a humorless laugh. "Water." Over the next few days, strange things began happening around Dry Creek. The church delayed orders from Broken Pine. A feed supplier suddenly claimed Wyatt's payment receipts had gone missing. At the mercantile, conversations stopped whenever Rosie entered. One evening, Rosie found a folded notice nailed to the ranch gate. That Broken Pine's land claim might be under legal dispute. Wyatt crumpled the paper silently after reading it. But Rosie saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, now saw how late he stayed awake, studying account books beside lamplight after everyone else slept, saw how his injured shoulder stiffened every morning before he thought anyone noticed. Then one cold afternoon, while organizing papers inside Wyatt's office desk, Rosie found something hidden beneath old land records. 2 signatures, one forged, and beside it, payment records tied directly to Clyde Rawlins' cattle company. Her stomach tightened. That same evening, Ben Mercer finally spoke the truth. Years ago, the old ranch hand said quietly beside the stable ruins, Wyatt saved Clyde's life during a blizzard up near Dead Horse Ridge. Rosie looked up sharply. Ben nodded slowly. Nearly froze himself doing it. His jaw tightened. Few months later, Clyde started trying to steal this land after hearing about the underground spring. Rosie stared toward the dark hills surrounding Broken Pine. All this time, Wyatt had been fighting someone he once trusted. 2 nights later, Rosie walked straight into the crowded saloon in Dry Creek, carrying the forged documents beneath her arm. The piano stopped first, then the talking. Cowboys turned slowly toward her as muddy boots crossed the wooden floorboards. Clyde Rawlins sat near the far poker table, wearing a gray wool coat and a silver watch chain across his vest. He smiled the moment he saw her. "Well now," he drawled. Broken Pine sent a messenger. Rosie's hand tightened around her cane. Without shaking, she threw the false ledger book onto the table in front of him. The room erupted into murmurs. "You bribed the land office clerk," Rosie said steadily. "And you set that fire." Clyde leaned back slowly in his chair. Then his eyes dropped toward her bad leg. "Careful, miss," he said with a crooked smile. "Wouldn't want you falling apart in public again." Several men looked down awkwardly. Before Rosie could answer, a chair scraped violently across the floor behind her. Wyatt Granger stepped forward. Rainwater still clung to his coat from the ride into town. His injured shoulder remained stiff beneath the fabric, but his voice came low and sharp enough to cut through the entire saloon. "The woman standing there," he said, "has more courage than any man in this room." Nobody moved. Clyde's smile slowly disappeared. Then, very carefully, his hand drifted toward the revolver, resting at his hip. The saloon fell dead silent. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere near the back wall, a whiskey glass rolled across a table and tipped onto the floor. Wyatt stood between Rosie and Clyde, without moving a single inch. His injured shoulder hung stiff beneath his coat, but his eyes never left Clyde's hand. "Don't," Wyatt said quietly. Clyde gave a crooked little grin. "You always did think you were better than everybody else." "No," Wyatt answered. "Just better than this." The sheriff pushed through the crowd then, one hand already resting on his badge. "That's enough," Sheriff Talbot barked. For a tense second, nobody breathed. Then Clyde slowly lifted both hands away from the revolver. Murmurs spread through the room immediately afterward, like released pressure from a storm. Sheriff Talbot grabbed the forged papers from the poker table, while Rosie stood frozen beside Wyatt. Her fingers still trembled around the handle of her cane. Clyde looked straight at her before the sheriff led him away. "This town'll turn on you again soon enough," he muttered coldly. Rosie did not answer, but Wyatt's hand moved quietly to the small of her back as Clyde disappeared through the saloon doors into the rain. The gesture lasted barely a moment. Still, Rosie felt it long after. By sunrise the next morning, news had spread across Dry Creek faster than wildfire through dry grass. The forged land records, the burned barn, Clyde Rawlins being taken into custody outside the sheriff's office. People gathered in knots outside the general store, whispering beneath the early spring sun, while wagons rolled slowly through muddy streets. For the first time in months, Broken Pine Ranch no longer looked like the weak side of a losing fight. Still, Rosie packed her suitcase again 3 days later. Quietly, carefully, she folded her dresses while Wyatt worked outside rebuilding fencing with Ben Mercer. The ranch house smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh paint now. Wyatt had already begun repairing the porch railing damaged during the storm. Rosie paused near the window. She watched him below through the glass, hat low over his brow, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, hammer resting against one shoulder while he listened to Ben, talking beside the wagon. He looked tired, but peaceful in a way she had not seen before. Rosie lowered her eyes. That was exactly why she needed to leave. A man like Wyatt deserved a life without whispers following him through town, without pity disguised as curiosity every time people looked at the woman beside him. She finished packing before supper. That afternoon, the whole territory gathered outside Dry Creek for the spring cattle auction. Rows of wagons lined the open field near the rail station. Horses stamped through churned mud, while ranchers argued prices beneath striped canvas tents. Smoke from roasting beef drifted through cool mountain air. Rosie planned to leave quietly after the auction crowd thinned. No goodbye long enough to hurt. But just as she stepped toward the edge of the gathering, a familiar voice echoed across the stockyard. Rosie. She stopped instantly. Wyatt stood atop the wooden auction platform near the cattle pens. Every head in town turned toward him. Rosie's pulse stumbled. Wyatt climbed down slowly from the platform steps until he stood directly in front of her, beneath hundreds of watching eyes. For 1 second, neither spoke. Then Wyatt reached for her hand. Not hidden, not hesitant, openly. Gasps and whispers moved through the crowd. Rosie tried pulling back at first out of instinct more than fear, but Wyatt held on gently. His thumb brushed once against her knuckles. Then he faced the town. "Most of you remember the day Rosie fell outside St. Matthew's Church," he said evenly. Nobody interrupted. "You remember who laughed." His voice stayed calm. "And who walked away." The wind carried softly across the auction yard. Wyatt tightened his hold on Rosie's hand just slightly. "This town spent years making her feel like something to hide," he continued. "Well, I won't." Rosie looked up at him slowly. Wyatt met her eyes first before looking back toward the crowd. "Anybody who disrespects this woman," he said, "disrespects me too." Complete silence followed. Not angry silence this time. Something different. Near the front of the crowd, June Holloway suddenly stepped forward beside her supply wagon. "There's something else folks ought to know," she called out. People turned toward her. June folded her arms tightly against the spring wind. Every winter for the last 3 years, Rosie Whitaker paid medicine costs for children at the church orphan house. Rosie's face drained of color. June continued before she could stop her. "She bought blankets too. And coal." The widow glanced around sharply. Did it without asking anybody for praise, while half this town barely treated her decent. Whispers broke out immediately. Several townspeople lowered their eyes. Earl Dunning from the feed store looked suddenly very interested in the mud beneath his boots. Rosie stood completely still. "You knew," she whispered to June. June smiled softly. "Saw your receipts myself." For a moment, Rosie could not speak at all. Then Wyatt looked down at her with something quiet and steady in his expression. Not pity. Never pity. Pride. That evening, the sun dropped low behind the Absaroka Mountains as Wyatt drove the wagon slowly back toward Broken Pine Ranch. Snow still clung to the fence lines in pale silver patches. Meltwater shimmered beside the road. Neither of them talked much. They didn't need to. When they reached the ranch house, Rosie noticed the porch railing first, freshly painted white. 2 rocking chairs sat beside the door facing the mountains. Wyatt helped her carefully down from the wagon before reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small silver ring worn smooth with age. "My mother's," he said quietly. Rosie stared at it speechless. Wyatt did not kneel dramatically, did not make a show for anyone. He simply stood there beneath the evening sky, with nervousness finally showing through the calm man she had spent months trying to understand. "I don't want you living like somebody left behind anymore," he said softly. The mountains stood silent around them. Wind moved gently through the pine trees beyond the house. Wyatt's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "I want you home with me. For good. Rosie looked down at the old ring, trembling slightly in his hand, then back at him. Her right leg still ached from years of damage. Her past still existed. The town would probably never become perfect. But standing there beside Broken Pine Ranch, none of those things felt bigger than the way Wyatt Granger looked at her, like she belonged. Slowly, Rosie placed her hand into his, and for the first time in her life, nobody looking at her saw something broken. The mountains around Broken Pine Ranch stayed quiet as the last light faded behind the snow-covered ridges. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted inside the barn, and the porch boards creaked softly beneath Rosie's slow steps. Maybe that's why this story lingers, because deep down, most people know what it feels like to stand outside the warmth of a room and wonder if they truly belong there. To carry old scars so long that they begin to feel like your name. And maybe, if we're honest, we all hope someone will one look past the damage and choose us anyway, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but with steady hands and an open heart. Wyatt never tried to erase Rosie's pain. He simply made room for her beside his own. Sometimes that's what healing really looks like. Not grand speeches, not perfect endings. Just one person staying when the world expects them to walk away. And maybe love in the Old West was never about saving somebody. Maybe it was about reminding them they were never beyond saving to begin with. If this story stayed with you tonight, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what moment touched your heart the most. And if you'd like, stay a little longer here with us. There are still more quiet roads, forgotten towns, and deeply human stories waiting just beyond the next firelight.